Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's exciting policy session on the Conservative Network's response to the 1619 curriculum. Before I hand it on over to the Heritage Foundation, BRIDGET WEISENBURGER, who will be moderating today's session, I just want to go through a few housekeeping tips. So if you'd like to ask our panelists questions during the presentation, you'll be able to submit questions through Pathable's chat box feature on this session's page. The chat box will also be used to share handouts during the presentation. We already have some great handouts in there from the Heritage Foundation and AEI and the WOODSON Center and Discovery Institute in the description for today's session. Also, just a note, if you're interested in rewatching this workshop, we will be distributing this through ALEC Connect later this week, and we'll also be releasing it on social media channels through the Education Task Force monthly newsletter and through other means here at ALEC. But I'm going to kick it off to Bridget over at Heritage to kick off today's session.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you everyone for joining us for this important conversation about an ideology that's been working its way through our schools, our workplaces, and our government. It might seem like a daunting task, but I believe the people you'll hear from in this workshop will clarify the threat and provide a hopeful path forward. We want to give you the tools to respond in your state, so please do add your questions to the chat and we'll get to them in the Q&A. To get us started, I'm pleased to introduce Christopher Rufo, who's been on the front lines calling attention to how critical theory is infiltrating government, workplaces, and schools. He's the director of the Discovery Institute Center on Wealth and Poverty, a contributing editor at City Journal, and a current visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Over to you, Chris.
Great. Well, thanks for the introduction. Yeah, I guess I'll give a brief overview of a investigative reporting project that I did over the summer, which yielded some great results that unfortunately will probably be thrown out as soon as the Biden administration begins. But what I did was a series of investigative reports for the New York Post, City Journal, Wall Street Journal, and other publications using whistleblower documents from within federal agencies, where they were teaching the kind of critical race theory 101. They were teaching that the United States is a fundamentally and irredeemably racist country. They were teaching that white employees, by virtue of their birth characteristics, have internalized white supremacy. And then in some cases, they were actually forcing employees to attend racially segregated training programs, a specific room designated for employees, minority employees, and another room for white employees. And in one case at the Sandia National Nuclear Laboratories, they hosted a retreat for white male executives. They told them that their white male culture was analogous to the KKK, to mass shootings, to white supremacists, to all of these terrible things that they were writing on the board, which I documented through photographic evidence. And then they actually had them denounce, deconstruct, and then denounce their white male Christian heterosexual identity piece by piece, and then write letters of apology to women and people of color, because of their existence, basically. And this obviously is, I mean, it's horrific. It's extraordinarily, it's kind of intellectually bankrupt, and then morally, I think, bankrupt as well. And what we saw is that these employees were simply too scared to speak up. And I documented at more than a dozen different federal agencies, everything from the FBI to the National Nuclear Laboratories, to the Department of Homeland Security, to the Department of Justice, to the Treasury Department. These almost identical, ideologically identical trainings were taking place. And employees in many cases are civil servants. They joined government to maybe in many cases for middle-aged employees 20 years ago to provide a service to the public, and they're just getting browbeaten and blindsided and really bowled over by these ideological training programs. And in all cases, the whistleblowers I talked to, they love this country. They recognize that this country does have a history of racism and discrimination, but they were really intimidated and terrified by these programs and felt that they couldn't speak up or they would be denounced as racist or as kind of retrograde elements of the bureaucracy. And that's why they leaked the documents to me so I could raise the alarm. And you know, one thing I found is that that one particular comment that struck out to me was that some of these departments of diversity and inclusion, which on the surface is great, right? Diversity is great, inclusion is great, and I think it's you know, it's kind of a truism that those things are good. But what one person told me is that the Office of Women and Minority Inclusion in the Treasury Department functions as an internal intelligence service. That's the quote from my whistleblower. And this whistleblower said that they're being bombarded every day with these kind of cult programming messages. And anyone who disagrees is really hunted down by these internal diversity teams and then held up for public shaming. And that's obviously completely wrong. Luckily, my reporting caught the eye of many people, and I was able to get it out in print media, and then shared an opening monologue with Tucker Carlson. The president saw this monologue and instructed his team to call me the next morning, bright and early West Coast time. And then within 3 weeks, they had issued an executive order banning these trainings from the federal government, banning these trainings from federal contractors, a majority of the Fortune 500 companies. And I think that, you know, despite the kind of sad fact that they will likely get thrown out upon a Biden administration's first 100 days, I think it sets a template for what executives can do. And if you're listening from a state, I think governors have a kind of analogous capacity. You know, when you're the president or when you're the governor, you've won office and you have a right to make sure that your administration reflects the values that brought you into office. And I think that the executive should have a kind of reporting program, you know, where all the subordinate agencies are sharing with the executive the kind of training programs they're doing. But I think executive action, abolishing and banning these divisive programs, is a key kind of tool in the toolkit for actually getting a handle on this. And I think that you know, we should look at this not as an isolated case, but this is happening at all levels, from local school districts and red states all the way up to federal agencies. And I'm grateful that there is now a growing movement of people that are starting to push back, and it's been fun to be part of that team.
Thank you, Chris. I often find that understanding how pervasive a problem we're dealing with is half the challenge. To talk about how we should respond, I'm delighted to bring into the conversation Bob Woodson, a longtime leader of the civil rights movement. He is the founder and president of the Woodson Center, and most recently launched 1776 Unites to build a positive movement in response to the overwhelming narrative of oppression, grievance, and ignorance in Americans' history.
Well, thank you. And Chris, it's really good to meet you. I'm a big fan.
But likewise.
But I think it's important to understand, as a veteran of the civil rights movement, I can tell you that critical race theory is the new racism. And in many ways, it's more insidious than the old racism. At least the racism that is practiced by the Klan and the John Birch Society is external. But the new racism is being done in the name of promoting social justice for Blacks, starting with the George Floyd instance. And so what the left has done is hijack the rich moral authority of the civil rights movement. But in the process, as soon as they did this, then they migrated to denigrating the values of family. They were burning Bibles in Portland, denigrating the Christian cross. They're saying that the nuclear family is Eurocentric and therefore racist. But so what they have done is the very values that enabled Black America to survive slavery and discrimination are the very values being denigrated by the left in the name of helping Blacks. And so we believe that the way you combat that is not by offering a counter argument. That's why we brought together, since they were using Blacks as the messenger and as the bludgeon to denigrate this country's institutions. We felt it was important for the messenger on the other side to be led by Blacks as well. That's why at the Woodson Center, we brought together not only scholars, but also community activists, because it's not enough to, so we wanted to offer an alternative narrative that is both inspirational and aspirational, and also to give evidence that the assumption, the basic propositions that the conditions facing, the challenges facing Black community today is somehow related to the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. Well, that is patently untrue, but it's not enough to present an argument in support of that proposition. What we're presenting is evidence, and we believe, and that's where conservatives are falling short, that evidence is a much more effective antidote to an argument when you can present evidence and convince people. And also, since the Black community is being used as a moral authority, as a foundation, it is important for us to go to the Black community, for them to stand up and challenge the left to say they don't speak for us. For instance, the left says we should defund the police. Well, polls indicate 80% of the Black community want increased police because they are the ones suffering the consequence of police nullification or the Ferguson effect. According to polls, 62% of even low-income Blacks refute the notion that they're being held up by racial discrimination. They do not believe racial discrimination today is the biggest challenge that they face. And there have been study after study that race is not what Black people get up and think about all day and every day. And so therefore, we believe if we're going to push back against this assault, that it is important to build bridges to the Black community so they can speak for themselves. And that's why 1776, we're highlighting evidence that there were 20 Blacks who were born slaves who died millionaires, that the Black family was central to the restoration and survival. In 1930 and 1940, when racism was enshrined in law, and unemployment rate in the Black community during the Depression was 40%. Our marriage rate was the highest in the country of any group. Elderly people could walk safely in our communities without fear of assault. So what we're doing is we're going back and presenting evidence from the past, but also there are institutions like the Pineywood School, a Black boarding school in Pineywood, Mississippi, that for the past 110 years has been educating low-income children from some of the most challenging backgrounds in the nation, and 96% of them go on to the finest colleges throughout the country. So if we want to push back against this assault on our nation, we must ally ourselves with the Black community because they are the sleeping giant. We need to invest, scholars need to interact with and document and tell the story. And so it's only through this kind of evidence-based challenge to the left will we see change and reform occur. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful reminder that there are better ways than critical race theory. To give us some concrete ways we can respond through policy, I'd like to bring in my colleague, Jonathan Butcher, a senior policy analyst for Heritage's Center for Education Policy. Jonathan?
Thank you, Bridget, and thanks to Alec for putting this panel together. And it's an honor to be here with these scholars and researchers. So thank you for the chance to be here. As Mr. Woodson was saying just a moment ago, he was describing, I think, what is a truly conservative approach to thinking about responding in civic life today to the ideas of critical race theory and how it is touching so much of the institutions and parts of our everyday world around us. I think looking to the way that communities and individuals responded before in prior generations is such a powerful lesson for us today. And so thank you, Mr. Woodson, for those remarks. Let me very quickly say that these ideas of critical race theory trace back to critical legal theory, which traces back to big T theory before. And this is something that has percolated in universities, for a century or more. And it's important for us to recognize, both from a policy perspective and from a research as well as from a community activism perspective, that this concept of theory is not something that can peacefully coexist as designed with the classical liberal world that we have founded the United States on. This classical liberal order and the Enlightenment ideas on which we've rested this concept of free speech, of the value of the individual, it cannot peacefully coexist with something that, like Delgado and Stefanski have written, is actually meant to be critical of liberalism. The ideas of Derek Bell, and even before that, going back to Horkheimer and the very early schools of thought where these ideas generated, they were meant to displace systems of power. That's what the goal is. And so, as Chris was saying earlier, these ideas of diversity are important. These ideas of talking about multiculturalism, they all have worth in them of being able to develop tolerance and empathy, and that's important. But that is not what the stated aims of the founders of critical race theory, nor the theory that came before that. That's not what their stated aims are. So very quickly, let's just say that this has now metastasized, I would say, and perhaps a very visible way in California, where they are considering an ethnic studies curriculum that would be required for high schoolers before they finish. Now, the governor just vetoed a bill that would make this a requirement, but nevertheless, the state school board is continuing its work to build this curriculum for release next year, regardless of whether it's required. Now, why would an ethics studies program somehow be connected to critical race theory? It's not just that it is trying to tell the stories of those who hadn't been told before in American history. There's a whole section in the recommended material on intersectionality, which comes straight out of the playbook of critical race theory. The concept that you can identify with multiple groups at one time, and so amplify your victimhood because you are a member of one or more oppressed groups. That's in there, that's in the material. Likewise, there's widespread support, according to polls from Education Week, that teachers across the country are supportive of the material in the Black Lives Matter curriculum. And that contains material about the ideas of both white supremacy and white fragility in American currency, which is supposed to be taught to elementary school students. These are not small things. These are not just sort of pieces of critical race theory that's leaked out. This is now in our schools and before parents and educators, which sort of makes us cast sort of a sideways glance at the 1619 Project from the New York Times. That is also in, according to the Pulitzer Center, some 4,500 schools, especially those in Chicago and Washington, D.C. But we're talking about entire states here in places like California, Washington State, even in Ohio, where the State Board of Education passed a resolution that included requirements for diversity training among members and educators. Now, to their credit, as Ian can tell you, they invited him to come speak before them to talk about some contrary ideas, but nevertheless, that resolution has been there. They've already had to take down some curricular materials that many found objectionable. So this is very much before us today. So what are the solutions? What are the answers? Well, I would point to institutions like represented by those here on the panel, particularly the curricular materials that are being assembled by 1776 Unites. Those materials and more can be found on the Heritage Foundation's curriculum resource page. We have a whole page that links to those materials and more. So that's a start. I also think, as Angela will say more in a few minutes, that organizations such as the Goldwater Institute, who have proposed making the curriculum from public schools more transparent for anyone, taxpayers and more, to access and see that material before it becomes a headline. That altogether too often is when parents find out that something objectionable is in a school, is when a reporter or someone else has got wind of it, and then they found out that it's already been presented to students. So by making this material transparent and accessible by taxpayers ahead of time, I think that's a very good step. I would also say that the pandemic has given us an interesting pause, I think, on some of this effort to change the way that civics content is presented. And that's because as students have been home with their parents, parents have the chance to see what their children are being taught. They have a chance to respond to what is being put before parents. I think the movement towards these pandemic learning pods is very important, and it should be made available to more families, regardless of background or their economic ability to participate. This is something where lawmakers can look to make sure that there are not regulations getting in the way of pandemic pods. In fact, there are already examples that are treating pandemic pods like at-home daycares, which are highly regulated already. And so there are ways that the State Policy Network has produced material that talks about these regulations and how to get rid of those. So pandemic pods are a start. Transparency for public school curriculum is another. Answering the curriculum that is out there with alternatives is a third. And then finally, very quick before I finish, I have to add that the issue of free speech on campus is something that many people in our movement, the conservative world, have followed for several years. And I think that as we look at it as a policy issue where there needs to be a requirement for university administrators to enforce sanctions on students who violate the free speech rights of others, or to get rid of free speech zones, all of that is good and very important. But don't miss the language that both professors, especially students though, are using when they conduct a shoutdown. If you read the transcripts of what students said at Evergreen State College in Washington State when they took over campus there, or at Columbia when they took over the library a couple of years ago, or from Princeton in their recent letter from their president about systemic racism on campus there, notice that the language that they use, words like decolonization, as well as white supremacy, as well as talking about the need for safe spaces, they all come straight from the critical race theory playbook. This is what we are reaping after sowing the seeds of critical theory in universities for so long. This is the result that now has come from it. And so it's not just a policy issue for state lawmakers, although that is incredibly important. But we also have to recognize that it is these ideas that have now taken root. And that's why free speech on campus is more than just a policy issue. It's an urgent topic, both as a matter of maintaining the civil society that we are so desperately, I think, trying to preserve right now. So thank you, Bridget.
Thanks, Jonathan. There's so much to unpack there, and I hope we can get to it in the Q&A. Ian Rowe has spent much of his career helping students escape poverty through education. For 10 years, he led a network of public charter schools in the South Bronx and Lower East Side of Manhattan, where he got to see firsthand what is actually needed to help students succeed. Today, he is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Domestic Policy Studies. Ian.
Thank you, Bridget. It is such an honor to be part of this group, and I'm also very proud to say that I'm working with Bob as part of the 1776 Unites movement. I also would like to talk to you, perhaps from the perspective of a boots on the ground perspective, of an alternative to critical race theory in education. And that's ensuring that every parent has the power to choose a great school for their child, and that more young people must be taught to understand how embracing the principles of family, faith, education, entrepreneurship, and hard work versus rejecting those principles is the best pathway to become an agent of their own uplift. As you said, for the last decade, I ran a network of public charter schools in the heart of the South Bronx, educated more than 2,000 students, almost exclusively from low-income communities, primarily Black and Hispanic students. These were children of parents like mine who emigrated from Jamaica, West Indies, who wanted their child to have a shot at. And our parents knew what their kids were up against. In the district where one of our schools is located, of the nearly 2,000 public school students beginning high school in 2015 in the South Bronx, only 2% graduated 4 years later ready for college, meaning that 98% of students either dropped out of high school before completing their senior year, or they actually did manage to graduate, but they still were required to take remedial classes because they couldn't do college level math or reading. You know, by contrast, and that's why choice is so important, public charter schools like ours were significantly outperforming the district schools, not only on state tests, but entry and persistence in college. So it comes as no surprise that parents in these predominantly Black and Hispanic communities, you know, encompassing some of the poorest congressional districts in the country, are desperate for more high quality educational options. This overwhelming demand demonstrates that parents want the best for their children and should be given the power of choice. Now, many of these parents may have faced racial discrimination and other challenges in their own lives, and they do fear that their children might as well, but they know that a great education can make a difference. They do not believe that their children are doomed to be shackled by the horrors of America's legacy of slavery. And they want to be able to choose a school that believes that their kids can succeed. Yet critical race theory says every disparity is due to race. But our parents know if our teachers had the highest of expectations and were empowered with curricula such as what 1776 Unites is producing that can help children develop character-based strengths like integrity, resiliency, agency, the belief that you can be the master of your own destiny, then those children can lead life on their own terms, even in the face of structural barriers. That's why it's so important to understand success, both historically and contemporary. For example, the dominant narrative around Black boys is that they are destined to fail in a society that's rigged against them. But what's lost in that narrative is the millions of Black men historically and contemporary that are thriving, that have been successful. The question is whether are all of these men just exceptions, or they're all just LeBron James? There's a great study entitled The Economic Success of Black Men in America. They tracked a cohort of Black men born between 1957 and 1964 from their early years to ages 50 and older in order to determine how many have made it into the middle class or higher by midlife, and what factors were behind that success. What they found was fascinating. Nearly 60% had made it into the middle class. We'd love that number to be higher, but what is it that's special about that 60%? Were there any patterns that could be replicated that could provide an inspiring pathway to young people of all races? What the study found was that the overwhelming majority of Black men who'd made it into the middle class had followed a few key steps. They graduated from college, sometimes served in the military, found full-time work, and married. In addition, they usually had a faith commitment. And most importantly, they said they had a sense of personal agency, which meant from them, they felt they were determining the course of their own lives, as opposed to feeling that they had no control over the direction of their own lives. Another study shows amongst Black millennials who completed their education, found full-time work, then married, then had children, what is often referred to as the success sequence, 91% avoided poverty, and the vast majority entered the middle class. What these studies and common sense show us is that we do not have to accept an ideology that says that race is an all-purpose, all-powerful reason for failure, or that barriers associated with race are insurmountable. Parents have to have the choice to be able to send their children to schools that help build this overcomer's mindset, and that schools can teach the behaviors, like following the success, that empower young people to be masters of their own destiny. And let me just end with the words of Frederick Douglass from his 1859 self-made man speech. Quote, The lesson taught at this point by human experience is simply this, that the man who will get up will be helped up, and the man who will not get up will be allowed to stay down. This rule may appear somewhat harsh, but in its general application and operation, it is wise, just, and beneficent. I know of no other rule which can be substituted for it without bringing social chaos. Personal independence is a virtue, and it is the soul out of which comes the sturdiest manhood. But there can be no independence without a large share of self-dependence, and this virtue cannot be bestowed. It must be developed from within, end quote. Our kids need to grow up in a culture in which schools, families, faith-based institutions remind them of their ability to become masters of their own destiny. This is not pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, but recognizing their own personal role in achieving their own uplift alongside working with strong schools, families, faith-based institutions, and community-based organizations. That's the compelling alternative to critical race theory.
Thank you, Ian. It's such a beautiful reminder of what we really should be striving for in our education system. We're going to get to your questions soon, so feel free to start adding those in. But first, I want to bring in Angela Saylor, Vice President of Heritage's Fulner Institute. She's been working to build the movement in response. Angela, can you give us some recommended resources and share how ALEC members can get involved?
Sure. Thank you, Bridget, and thank you to ALEC and all the distinguished panelists here today. You know, as we survey the creep of critical race theory, we can't help but recall Abraham Lincoln's warning to us that all the armies of Europe and Asia could not by force take a drink from the Ohio River or make a track on the Blue Ridge on a trial of 1,000 years. So no, if destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher as a nation of free men who will live forever or die by suicide. And that's why our call to action is so important today. You know, how do we stand as a bulwark against the destruction? How do we serve as the battleship for truth and liberty? Well, we do it by boldly rejecting critical race theory. You know, we are a land of the free with unlimited opportunity, and our founding ideas and institutions reflect the inherent equal rights of every individual. While we sometimes fall short of these ideas, our system provides the freedom to deliberate and arrive at universal truth that transcends race. For decades, many Americans have worked to ensure that their children are not forced to endure a one-size-fits-all system, and Americans can agree on the importance of parents and the family and the key decisions that family and parents make for their children's education. This is consistent with the principles of federalism. The great French thinker, Alexis de Tocqueville, marveled at what he called the science of association, the American habit of citizens coming together to solve common problems or achieve shared purposes. So we've got to continue to come together with all the good work that we've heard from all the panelists. And so for the doers, you know, we are encouraging to continue to round up the troops, to inspire action, to assemble, to gather, and to respond with the data, the research, and the analysis. Through the work of coalitions, the power of petitions and engagement, we must continue to preserve free speech on campuses, as Jonathan mentioned. For the influencers, we have to continue to use our power to sway, to empower parents to denounce the role of educators becoming agents for social change through curriculum and social discipline and testing and civic engagement, as Bob Woodson talked about. And through involvement and in partnership with school boards, the media, and relationships with teachers, we have to insist on K-12 curriculum and transparency. State policymakers should require that public schools make that curricula and the resources available to the public. And as we are working with our coalitions and our scholarly working groups and in local communities. We are also working to preserve work and creating networks that protect individuals from the doctrine of victimhood. And we're working to protect our politics from the tyranny by those who would call themselves self-oriented and anointed oppressed. So we have no boundaries when it comes to preserving America. And that's, again, why we have to work together. And I believe we will open the hearts, minds, and doors of millions of Americans who envision an America where civil society flourishes, life is protected, and families as a whole are doing well. And again, those Americans that we're trying to reach are envisioning an America where liberty, equality, and opportunity aren't just the gifts we inherited, they're the endowment that we pass on. And so we continue to look at the resources, the papers, the webinars, the education, the briefings that are taking place across the country, and also with our Restoring Civics Working Group to connect these dots for people, to give them resources and the motivation to continue to push. And all the effort from the 1776 project to Bill McClay's book, Land of Hope, we are showing that collectively and together we can push back on things like a New York Times 1619 project. So Bridget, I look forward to the rest of the panel and thank you for the opportunity to discuss a call to action.
Thank you, Angela. So we have a lot of questions coming in, and I'm going to start with one that we've been hearing a lot about, the 1619 project curriculum that's being adopted in schools across the country. What can lawmakers be doing and citizens be doing to ensure that students are actually learning the truth of our nation's founding? And I'll kick it to the panel, and whoever wants to jump in, go for it.
Well, this is Ian. I would offer that one of the things you should do is create a compelling alternative. So with 1776 Unites, that's exactly what we've done. We've created a curriculum that we actually believe does not run away from the history of slavery and oppression in this country, but as opposed to taking this very narrow, in our view, a perversely selective view of American history, ignoring the amazing stories of resiliency, telling the stories of, as Bob said, individuals who born slaves and died millionaires, and thousands of other stories of Black individuals who embraced the ideas of faith, family, hard work, free enterprise, entrepreneurship, as the vehicle through which they moved from persecution to prosperity, and telling a more complete history of the United States. It's unbelievable, for example, that the 1619 Project doesn't mention at all something called the Rosenwald Schools. The Rosenwald Schools, for those who don't know, it was a partnership between Julius Rosenwald, then the head of Sears Roebuck, which is the largest retailer, to build more than 5,000 schools, predominantly in the South, to educate Black children because of segregation. And in these schools were marvelous examples of high levels of literacy, closing of achievement gaps, and an unbelievable story of success and independence. And yet it's not mentioned at all in the 1619 Project. So that's a deliberate exclusion of the power of what individuals of all races can do, even in the most adverse circumstances. So I very much encourage it to look at 1776 Unites and other curricula that seeks to tell a complete story of the African-American experience in the United States.
Thanks, Ian. Jonathan, I know you've had some stuff you're working on. Would you want to share?
Yeah, Bridget, thank you. I think from a policy perspective, it's important for lawmakers to be scrupulous about the movements to bring, I think, large scale changes to standards, in particular around civics these days. Things like the iCivics effort need to be looked at very closely because there are pieces and positions that they've taken as a group and in their coalition that really need to be just recognize so that people don't get in ahead of themselves I think that there, some of the games approach that iCivics has taken, I think is an effective way to convey the material. I do think there are some positions that they've taken or are noted as a coalition that policymakers want to make sure they're aware of around other issues outside of civics that might help to evaluate what's going on. I would say, the work that has been done in the school choice world is going to be very important in the next couple of years in particular. I think this is opening up an opportunity for policymakers at the state level to once again consider those things like education savings accounts, as well as charter schools, as well as the learning pods we were talking about before. There are stories of families who have been using education savings accounts during the pandemic, and it allowed them to adjust very quickly once the physical school that their child was attending had closed down. And so again, this is just to echo what Ian was saying. I think school choice it needs to be, it's not just a talking point anymore. Like, this is a reality for families all over the country. And so states have a real opportunity to seize the moment here.
May I just add a footnote to this? I think it's important for legislators and to go around the gatekeepers in the Black community and go directly into the community suffering the problem. There are two examples. One, Dick Riordan, who is a conservative first mayor of Los Angeles in 1990. 2 years before Dick Riordan announced for office, he went into East LA, low-income Hispanic community, and worked with an education after-school program with Sister Jenny Lichtenberg, a liberal nun. But he built 2 years of trusting relationship, recruited his friends, and helped build a state-of-the-art facility in that community. And then he ran for office and was the first Republican in 35 years. And when he ran for re-election, he got 60% of every demographic because, and Steve Goldsmith in Indianapolis, Indiana, a few years later did the same thing. It is important to go in and build relationships of trust by addressing concrete and specific problems that people have. Because if you plant charitably, you can harvest politically, but you don't plant and harvest in the same year. And through those relationships, you then can talk about other challenges like education, but you got to earn the trust by engaging with people around the gatekeepers.
That's so helpful. We have one really great question here. What are some of the early warning signs for parents to be aware of that would indicate critical theory was part of the curriculum?
When your little 8-year-old girl comes home and say, "Mommy, I don't want to be a boy." Some of these schools are teaching all kinds of outrageous renditions of critical race theory, including sexual orientation, making people choose at a very young age. So I just think there are some outrageous indicators like that, but there are others as well.
Yeah, and I'd also say, look at some of the decisions that are being made. So for example, in San Diego, during the first semester of the 2019-20 school year, it was found that 20% of Black students received a D or an F grade, yet only 7% of white students received a similar D or F failing grade. And rather than say, what can we learn from the 80% of Black students who managed to pass, what can be learned from their practices, like potentially more hours studying? The San Diego School District said that that 13 percentage point difference between Black and white students failing is a result of a discriminatory grading system, and it must be because of systemic racism. And so therefore we need to completely overhaul the system for everyone. And in the name of anti-racism, they decided to no longer require homework to be submitted on time. And the insidious implication of that is they had to do this because, of course, these Black students are not able to submit their homework on time. It's those kinds of decisions that parents need to be very wary of, because in the name of quote unquote social justice, what they're doing is actually the most demeaning, the most insulting, and making these assumptions about a whole category of people solely based on an immutable characteristic of race. It's very dangerous, and I think parents really need to rise up against this kind of action when they see it happening in their schools.
Jonathan, do you want to add something there?
I think Chris just unmuted himself.
Go
Go
for
ahead, Chris, if you
All
have
right, thanks. Yeah, I think one key idea to hold in your mind as you think about critical race theory and critical theory more generally is that it strikes me that it is a really bifurcated concept as it's kind of implemented in practice. And I think one of the kind of great crimes of critical race theory in my mind is that it really serves to reinforce the social status of educational, academic, and political elites. So it is very high status for people of all racial backgrounds to denounce systemic racism, to denounce internalized white supremacy, to kind of evoke, kind of emotionally perform the kind of song and dance routine of critical race theory. It establishes their status in their kind of elite cultural stratus and gets them corporate sponsorships and speaking deals and media coverage. Again, people of all races. But what does it actually offer to the people in Ian's schools, in the communities where Robert Woodson's kind of community-based activists live? It really offers nothing. And in fact, as Ian and Robert both said, it actually undermines and destroys those organic, bottom-up, grassroots institutions, relationships, and intuition. So what you have is a really kind of a very elitist and then a very destructive thing, that it reinforces social status but destroys social institutions. And I think that we should not have any hesitation or any fear in really going after it. And if you are in a community where this is kind of taking hold in a school district, don't be afraid. Stand up, because it's not right, and it's really not even about. It's really not even how it characterizes this kind of new racial hierarchy. I think it's actually bad for everyone, and I would encourage policymakers, parents, civic leaders to stand up against it.
Wonderful. So we're coming up near time, but we have a little bit, and I really wanted to get from each of you, are there penetrating questions that can be asked of proponents of critical race theory to reveal the flaws of it and help them see more clearly those problems? And let's see, Chris, would you like to start? Go for it.
Jonathan, you've dug into the theory. Maybe you could answer that one. Yeah.
Well, I think it's sort of aligned with the last question. It's sort of like what signs to look for and then ask for explanation. So for example, if a school is recommending Howard Zinn's book, A People's History of the United States, I think that's a pretty clear sign. And it may seem innocuous, right? I think that if a school has a diversity training that is set up perhaps with a high profile speaker, which is happening in places like Fairfax and elsewhere. Montgomery County is talking about a $500,000 diversity audit of its school system. Things like this, I think, are keys. And then I think the next question, as everyone on this panel has talked about, is what are the solutions? What is the proposed answer instead of an apology, or instead of some admission of guilt? Is there something beyond that where you can actually move to the point of creating opportunity? I would say, in addition to the historical inaccuracies of the 1619 project, that's one of the things that it demands to be asked is, so what now? I mean, you've laid these things out. So what is the answer? Now, I believe that their lead editor responded by saying that reparations is the answer. But I think that the systemic change that is going to be needed in a school system, for example, such as dealing with the issues of residential assignment, which frankly is antiquated, right? It didn't make sense during the pandemic. It certainly didn't help to have kids assigned to a physical school then. We should be having hard discussions about why every child should be able to choose or have the option for a charter school, or even to have in a public school choice across their district. There should be a question for policymakers about why families that used education savings accounts were able to continue to pay for educational therapies and personal tutors during the pandemic when their peers in assigned public schools often could not, right? It's questions like that about pointing to what are the answers, right? I mean, if you're saying that all that's happened over the past 50 years has not brought the United States to a place that better affords opportunities, why then, what is your policy solution? And why are the policy solutions that are being proposed now when it comes to free speech on campus, to school choice, to all the way down the line about diversity trainings in the workplace, why are those not the answer? What is the problem with them? And if their answers are the same as before, that school choice takes money from public schools, or free speech on campus really only protects hate speech, those shouldn't satisfy anyone, right? Those are straw man arguments that can easily be taken apart when we explain why it matters that these private school choice programs, as well as charter schools, operate at less per student funding than assigned public schools. Why free speech actually matters, so that both sides of any issue can be heard, because right now that's not what's happening with the shoutdown. It's answers like these, I think, to those questions that are important for people in the conservative movement to be able to pose when those who are claiming that systemic racism is the item of the moment don't have a solution that brings more opportunity to people from every walk of life.
I believe that what you're saying is that people are motivated to change and improve their lives when they are shown victories that are possible, not injuries to be avoided. And so the challenge is, tell me, after someone has heard your presentation of the problem, what is it that a person can do who is in a situation, a problematic situation, like these killing fields that are in the urban centers? What does it do for people like that? In addition to which, issues like reparations, the new racism is being applied with the intention of helping Blacks, assuming that they're unfit to meet the standards of performance, and therefore the standards have to be dumbed down. Tell me how dumbing down a standard ends up assisting someone in those community struggles. So I think we should just put those kind of tell me, after I have heard your presentation, tell me, how can I improve the quality of my life?
I think it's such an important question, because we do have to figure out how to have a reasoned debate with those proponents of critical race theory. You know, for example, one of the fundamental beliefs of critical race theory is that any racial disparity is due to systemic racism, and as a result, there has to be some race-based solution. So in the case of reparations, yes, the author of 1619 says that basically the racial wealth gap is so huge that there's no way an individual Black person can close that gap. And so therefore, the federal government now needs to start showering Black descendants of slaves with government funding of about $150,000 to $200,000 per person, you know, a $14 trillion program. And yet, when you look at Nigerian Americans, for example, and the level of success that they have, they are just as Black as the native-born American, but typically within that culture of immigrants that come here within that community, and you could talk about Ghanaian Americans, Caribbean Americans, some native-born Black Africans, Black Americans who've embraced, again, family, faith, hard work. Those are succeeding at even higher levels. And in fact, if you take into account family structure, the average Black married Black family household has nearly twice the wealth of the average white single parent household. So what that suggests is that, perhaps there are factors outside of race that can drive upward mobility. And so if you're in a conversation with someone who's saying, no, 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 it's all based on racism, then how do you account for these differences? And not only these exceptions, but those in which there are patterns of excellence that can be tied back to behaviors such as the amount of numbers of hours studying, things like following the success sequence. Those are real behaviors. And my hope is that a reasoned discussion, even those who believe so deeply in critical race theory, have to confront the realities that there are lots of exceptions to the rules that they are saying, and these exceptions aren't in fact exceptions. They're demonstrated behaviors that are in the control of not only Black people, but people of all races to improve their own destinies.
Thank you. We're running up on time, so I want to give everyone a chance to answer this question. What is one thing that gives you hope? And then also, what is a concrete way someone can get involved? And what is like the low-hanging fruit that we should be working on right now? Let's go with Chris, if you'd like to start.
Yeah, one thing that's giving me hope is that we're now seeing groups of parents spontaneously organizing at schools around the country and pushing back on this. And I think this critical theory has gone under the radar, but when we find that it actually comes to the surface and is exposed and parents are given the information of what's actually happening, they organize and they push and they fight. I also think something that's very interesting right now is that Asian Americans are becoming politically engaged for the first time in American history. And they are running ballot measures in deep blue states like Washington and California, fighting back against this new racial orthodoxy and winning. So I think that there's a lot of good news and things that we can build on moving forward.
Jonathan, would you like to hop in?
Sure. I would have to say I am so inspired by the creation of charter schools and by the opportunities given to students through education savings accounts and private school scholarships. At the beginning of the pandemic, I was talking to David Hardy in Philadelphia, who's been a long time creator of schools there. And he said, we're not going to wait for Philadelphia to decide what to do about the pandemic. We're just going to get ready to deliver content to our students whenever we can. And so as well as I think the very thoughtful and thorough response from 1776 Unites to the 1619 Project is nothing short of inspiring.
Wonderful. Ian, a source of hope and a way to get involved.
Well, I run schools for a reason. And the reason I've run schools, I'm now designing a new network of international baccalaureate high schools to open in the South Bronx, is I fundamentally believe in the promise of America, and that this is an exceptional nation, and that we, in this country, we have rights and responsibilities. And I think the importance of school is to let young people know that all of these opportunities are within their grasp, but they play an incredible role. And there are lived behaviors that we have known now for generations in this country in order to fulfill that both national promise and an individual promise. And that there are behaviors associated with strong families, faith, hard work, entrepreneurship. They just are. Those have been the vehicles through which Americans have built wealth, Americans of all races, even in the most terrible circumstances. And we're still not there, obviously. But to deny the exceptionalism of our country is a bet against America. And I just think that's a bad deal. And it's much more hopeful. As Bob said, people are much more inspired by potential victories than injuries to avoid. There's an aspirational view of America that is yet unfulfilled, and I love running schools to shape the minds of young people to know that they have the ability to achieve that.
Wonderful. Bob, would you like to give us your hope?
Yeah, I think there's a thirst to support virtue deep in the DNA of American conscience. And we're seeing this in our response to our curriculum that Ian gave leadership to. We released our first 3 lessons, and within 7 days, we had 5,000 downloads. 1619